Hello and welcome to this e-learning series on transporting biological substances presented by ICC, the Compliance Center. In this series, we will cover transportation of biological substances and related materials such as cooling agents and preservatives. We'll look at transport by ground under the Hazardous Materials Regulations of Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is sometimes called 49 CFR. Then, we will look at shipping dry ice by air using the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations. At any time, you may stop the program or go back to review material you wish to see again. The goals of this series are to become familiar with identifying infectious substances, diagnostic specimens, and biological products, to know your responsibilities for transporting them under the Hazardous Materials Regulations and the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations, and to be able to prepare and offer for transport biological substances, including infectious substances, as well as cooling agents and preservatives. Our e-learning series will be divided into 7 parts. It is required that you have access to both the Hazardous Materials Regulations and the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations for reference as you complete this program. Part 1 will introduce us to the regulations involved in the transportation of biological substances by both ground and air. Part 2 will cover classification and identification of hazardous materials. We will look at classification of biological substances as well as other materials that may be used as preservatives and cooling agents. Also, we will review the tables used to give full information on transporting hazardous materials. In Part 3, we will discuss packaging requirements for ground and air transport. In Part 4, we will cover the requirements for identifying packages of biological substances using marks and labels. In Part 5, we will discuss shipping papers. We will go over what type of paperwork is required for various sorts of shipments and how to give full information on the dangers of the substances you are transporting. Part 6 will cover 3 topics: how to placard loads of biological substances, loading requirements and restrictions for biological substances, and reporting requirements for serious spills called accidental releases. The section will end with security awareness training as required under the Hazardous Materials Regulations of 49 CFR. There will be quiz questions given at the end of each section rather than all questions at the end of the presentation. You are able to refer to your reference materials from this series, as well as the Hazardous Materials Regulations and the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations, in order to answer all the questions. This course will refer to 2 sources for regulatory information. These are the U.S. National Regulations, which are known as the Hazardous Materials Regulations of Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations, also known as 49 CFR. We'll also look at the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations, also known as DGR, which covers commercial air transport. It is required that you have access to both of these regulations while completing this training and completing the quiz questions. Both may be purchased from ICC, the Compliance Center, if you wish, by calling 1-888-442-9628 in the U.S. or 1-888-977-4834 in Canada. Part 1 of our series will introduce us to the United States regulations that cover shipments of hazardous materials, such as biological substances, by ground and air. To help ease international trade, the United Nations has established a standard protocol for transporting hazardous materials, or as most international regulations call them, dangerous goods. It can be found in the UN recommendations for the transport of dangerous goods. This is also known as the Orange Book. This is not a regulation itself, but is a model on which most national and international regulations are based. The U.S. has established its own regulations called the Hazardous Materials Regulations based on the UN recommendations. These regulations can be found in Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or 49 CFR, which was created and is administered by the Department of Transportation. However, like most bodies, the Department of Transportation, or DOT, has modified the standard to meet specific American concerns and situations. Transport by air is the most hazardous way of transporting hazardous materials and requires extra restrictions compared to other modes. While the hazardous materials regulations contain a part dealing with domestic air transport, it also allows air shippers to use an international regulation created by ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization. This regulation is also based on the UN standard, but with additional restrictions such as size limits for packages. The DOT allows shippers to use the hazardous materials regulations for domestic shipment, but international air shipments must comply with the ICAO technical instructions for the safe transport of dangerous goods by air, usually called just the technical instructions, or TI for short. The ICAO technical instructions are written as regulations and are not an easy-to-use guide for air transport. To make things easier for air shippers using commercial airlines, an organization representing these airlines called IATA, the International Air Transport Association, has created a guidebook called the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations. This book is based on the legal requirements of the ICAO technical instructions, plus any additional restrictions or requirements of the airlines themselves. If you ship by international air carriers, you will normally have to comply with the IATA Dangerous Goods Regulations, or your shipment will be rejected by the airline.